No, but you are looking at the completely wrong variable here. I mean, the crash in 1929, it didn't just wipe out stock values or correct some overheated market.
Well, it definitely wiped out a lot of value, to be fair.
Right, of course it did. But it completely shattered the actual psychological foundation of capitalism itself. We're talking about a total collapse of confidence where private investment just stopped dead.
But they didn't just stop in a vacuum, right? I mean, the markets didn't suffocate on their own.
They stopped because suddenly the future went from being this, calculable risk to just an opaque, unknowable void. This is the ultimate Keynesian animal spirits moment. Private decision-making broke down because nobody trusted their own forecasts anymore.
I hear that, but you really have to look at the forensic data on this, specifically what Milton, Friedman, and Anna Schwartz found. The Federal Reserve allowed the U.S. money supply to contract by 33% between 1929 and 1933.
33%.
Exactly. A third of the entire nation's liquidity just vanished. Credit dried up, banks literally could not lend, and businesses couldn't make payroll. That isn't just market psychology. That is monetary strangulation.
Okay, yes, but you cannot ignore the actual contagion of fear. Look at the failure of the Bank of the United States in December 1930. That was the ignition point for nationwide panic.
It was a massive failure, sure.
Depositors were rushing to withdraw their savings, bank runs were spreading like wildfire, and trust basically evaporated across the entire financial system. People were operating out of pure terror, completely detached from whatever the money supply metrics were doing in the background.
Right. But while that terror spread, what was the Federal Reserve doing? They stood by passively. They offered no emergency liquidity, no reassurance, and no intervention whatsoever.
They completely froze up too.
Exactly. They allowed an exogenous liquidity shock to metastasize into a systemic depression because they failed to step in and act as a lender of last resort. The panic was real, but the environment that allowed it to destroy the economy was created by terrible monetary policy.
Which I think frames the ultimate tension of this entire debate perfectly. Was the Great Depression the inevitable result of capitalism's inherent instability, where markets amplify fear until they self-destruct?
Or was it a government-induced disaster? A failure of the Federal Reserve so profound that it destroyed an otherwise functioning, resilient market mechanism.
And this exact tension still shapes modern economic policy in the world we are living in now. Do crises demand aggressive government intervention to stabilize markets, or does intervention itself risk creating the very disasters it claims to prevent?
It is a massive, complex question.
It really is, and the stakes are incredibly high. Welcome to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking. In this deep dive, we are comparing the macroeconomic visions of John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman to see exactly how their clash built our modern world.
It's a phenomenal comparison because it goes so far beyond just math and charts. We are really looking at the fundamental relationship between democratic governments and market economies and, how we navigate crises.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the Keynesian engine. To understand why Keynes and Friedman viewed the 1929 crash so differently, we really have to look at how they viewed human behavior and the future itself.
Right, their foundational assumptions were completely opposed.
Exactly, and the sources make a huge point about this concept called night-E uncertainty. My understanding is that, calculable risk is sort of like playing roulette. You don't know the outcome of the next spin, but you know the exact mathematical odds, right?
Yeah, you know the board.
But night-E uncertainty, named after economist Frank Knight, means the future is genuinely unmeasurable. There are literally no odds to calculate.
That captures the distinction perfectly. Keynes, who was, deeply influenced by his background at Cambridge and the artistic philosophical Bloomsbury group, he argued that long-term economic investments do not work like roulette.
Because the real world is too messy.
Exactly. If you are building a new factory that is supposed to last 30 years, you cannot mathematically calculate what consumer tastes or competing technologies or global politics will look like in 3 decades. You just can't reduce it to a clean probability equation.
So because there is no reliable math for the long term, Keynes argued that economic actors rely on what he called animal spirits, basically these spontaneous urges to action rather than inaction.
Right, people just go with their gut because they have to do something.
But when a panic hits, like in 1929, those animal spirits just die. Business confidence vanishes, and the expected return on new investments, which Keynes called the marginal efficiency of capital, it just collapses entirely.
And the mechanism of that collapse is brutal. I mean, when people are terrified of an unknowable future, what do? They hoard cash, they prioritize liquidity above all else.
And this is where the Keynesian liquidity trap comes into play. I've always thought of it like trying to push on a string.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Central banks can drop interest rates all the way to zero, making money as cheap as possible to borrow. But if businesses are terrified of the future, you literally cannot force them to take out loans and build factories. The central bank is just pushing on a string.
It goes nowhere. And the downstream effects of that hoarding behavior set off what Keynes called the multiplier process, but operating in reverse. Let's trace the mechanism for a second.
Yeah, break that down.
So a manufacturing plant cancels a major expansion because they're scared. The construction workers who were supposed to build it, well, they don't get paid. Because those workers don't get paid, they stop buying goods at local grocery stores and clothing shops.
And then the shops suffer.
Exactly. The local store owners see their revenue drop, so they lay off their own staff. The initial drop in investment multiplies through the economy, spiraling downward into a persistent underemployment equilibrium. The economy essentially gets stuck at the bottom.
Which means the market has no self-steering wheel to pull itself out of the ditch. If the private sector simply will not spend because their animal spirits are crushed, Keynes argued the government absolutely must step in with deficit spending.
Because aggregate demand is basically a public good at that point.
Right. Aggregate demand, the total spending in the economy, has to be provided by the government when the private sector won't, just to break that cycle of fear.
He viewed aggregate demand as something the government must actively manage. The market just cannot reliably self-correct when psychological panic overrides economic fundamentals.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If Keynes believed the market was fundamentally broken and needed a mechanic, Milton Friedman believed the mechanic was the one actually destroying the engine.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Total shift. Friedman came from a working-class immigrant background in Brooklyn, and he looked at the historical data and saw a completely different reality. He did not see consumers as creatures driven by irrational animal spirits. He saw them as incredibly rational, forward-looking agents.
And that analysis led directly to the permanent income hypothesis. He argued that people do not just blindly react to the cash they have in their pockets today, they base their consumption on their expected lifetime wealth. They are optimizing their resources over the long haul.
Let's ground that in a real-world mechanism so listeners can really picture it.
Yeah.
Suppose the government tries a classic Keynesian trick during a recession and hands everyone a one-time $1,000 tax rebate to stimulate the economy.
Okay, classic stimulus check.
Under Keynesian theory, people take that $1,000, they spend it at the mall, and that triggers the multiplier effect to boost the economy. But Friedman's model completely flips that script.
Because under the permanent income hypothesis, consumers are smart enough to recognize that the $1,000 rebate is strictly temporary.
Right, that doesn't change their salary.
Exactly. It does not change their long-term permanent income trajectory. So instead of going on a shopping spree, they use that money to pay down a car loan, or they put it into a savings account to build a buffer against future shocks. They save it.
Which completely neutralizes the Keynesian multiplier, rendering that kind of fiscal stimulus highly ineffective.
Yes. They aren't panicked. They're just doing the math for their long-term survival. That completely changes the justification for government intervention.
And Friedman applied this exact same skepticism to central banking. What's fascinating here is how he introduced what he called the K% rule. He believed that human discretion in central banks creates economic disasters.
Because humans are flawed?
Right. You want a central bank to lead with conviction, but human beings are terrible at timing the market. Central bankers suffer from what he called long and variable lags.
The concept of long and variable lags is so fundamental to monetarism. There is a massive delay between recognizing you have a problem in the economy, figuring out a policy fix, and actually feeling the impact of that fix in the real world.
It's not like taking a sleeping pill at 9 a.m. and suddenly crashing at noon.
No, not at all.
A better analogy for a lag is taking a sleeping pill at 10 p.m., feeling absolutely nothing for 2 hours, getting frustrated, and taking a second one at midnight, and then sleeping through your alarm and missing work entirely the next day. The delayed reaction forces a massive overcorrection that does way more harm than good.
That captures the danger of discretionary policy perfectly. By the time a central bank stimulus actually works its way through the financial system and hits the real economy, the initial crisis might already be over.
The private market is likely already recovering on its own.
Right. So that delayed stimulus acts like throwing gasoline on a fire, pushing the economy into overdrive and causing massive inflation.
So to solve this, Friedman wanted to basically automate the process, strip away the human discretion entirely. His K% rule proposed growing the money supply at a steady fixed rate, say 3 to 5% every single year, strictly tracking the long-term growth of the economy.
Provide a solid baseline of stability and then just get out of the way. Let free enterprise and the market's price mechanism do the rest.
Okay, but theory is great on paper. We have Keynes arguing the government has to intervene to save us from our own fear, and Friedman arguing government intervention is exactly what causes the chaos. But history provided brutal stress tests for both frameworks. How did they actually hold up?
Well, the results were pretty dramatic.
Because I have to push back on the monetarist view here. If markets are so self-correcting and rational, why did we get the 1970s? I mean, it was an absolute economic mess.
The fascinating thing about the 1970s is that the decade actually vindicated Friedman in a spectacular way. To understand why, we have to look at the mechanism of the Phillips curve.
Right, the old Keynesian menu.
Exactly. Before the 70s, Keynesian policymakers believed they had discovered a reliable menu for the economy. They thought there was this exploitable inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment.
The idea was that you could permanently trade a little bit of higher inflation for lower unemployment. The government could just run the economy a little hot, accept a 4 or 5% inflation rate, and in exchange, everyone gets a job.
And it relied on this concept of money illusion. Workers feel richer because their nominal wages go up, even if inflation is silently eating the real purchasing power of those wages. So they spend more and businesses hire more.
But Friedman called out that illusion before the 70s even began. He predicted that trying to exploit the Phillips curve would inevitably cause accelerating inflation. Because the mechanism is simple, workers eventually figure it out.
They always do. When inflation goes up, their real purchasing power drops. Once they realize their larger paychecks buy fewer groceries, they demand even higher wages to keep up with the rising prices.
And then businesses have to raise prices to cover the higher wages, triggering a vicious wage price spiral.
Exactly. And this is where Friedman introduced the concept of the natural rate of unemployment. It's a baseline determined by the real structural realities of the labor market, like how long it takes people to find a job that matches their skills.
So if a central bank tries to artificially push unemployment below that natural rate by printing money, the temporary boost fades once expectations adjust, and it leaves you with nothing but runaway inflation.
Which is exactly what happened when the oil supply shocks hit in the 70s. We experienced stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment simultaneously.
The Keynesian model literally could not compute that outcome.
Right.
Their equations assumed inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions.
They were baffled. It took Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker aggressively hiking the federal funds rate all the way up to 20% to break the psychology of inflation and reset the economy. It was a brutal recession, but it proved Friedman's point: you cannot permanently manipulate unemployment with monetary inflation.
But Friedman does not get the final word. Just when the monetarist framework seemed utterly victorious, the 2008 global financial crisis happened. Central banks dropped interest rates to zero, hitting what economists call the zero lower bound.
They could not lower rates any further without going negative.
Exactly. Conventional monetary policy was suddenly completely out of ammo, the market was in free fall, and Friedman's steady money supply rules just weren't enough to stop the bleeding.
That crisis really forced the creation of what economists now call the new neoclassical synthesis. Modern central banks and governments realize they actually need both toolkits. The synthesis combines short-term Keynesian interventions with long-term monetarist rules.
We saw this play out in real time. When the 2008 crisis hit, and again during the massive economic freeze of the COVID-19 pandemic, policymakers deployed aggressive Keynesian fiscal stimulus.
Unprecedented levels of stimulus.
We are talking about over $14 trillion globally deployed during the pandemic. Governments did exactly what Keynes prescribed. When the private sector froze and supply chains locked up, the government stepped in with massive deficit spending to prevent a total demand collapse.
They absolutely did. They provided the aggregate demand that the market could not, but we also saw the monetarist consequences of that intervention.
Right, the bill always comes due.
To fund that massive fiscal stimulus, governments monetized the debt. The U.S. central bank expanded its balance sheet dramatically. If you look at the M2 money supply, which is a broad measure of all the cash, checking deposits, and easily convertible savings in the economy, it surged by nearly 27%.
27% is staggering. And true to Friedman's theory, the mechanism of inflation kicked in with a lag of about 12 to 24 months. Yeah, this unprecedented surge of money chasing a severely bottlenecked supply of goods.
Classic case of too many dollars chasing too few goods.
And that led directly to the massive 9.1% inflation peak we saw in June 2022.
The synthesis is messy in practice. We used Keynesian tools to avoid depression, but we paid for it with the exact monetarist inflation that Friedman warned about.
Think about this for a second. In the world we're living in now, every time you read the news and see a central bank adjusting interest rates to cool inflation, or a legislature arguing over passing a stimulus bill to save jobs, you are literally watching the ghosts of Keynes and Friedman battle it out in real time. Their theories are the operating code for our entire financial system.
The modern synthesis managed to merge their math, utilizing both fiscal stimulus in acute crises and monetary rules for long-term stability. But what is truly profound about this essay is the realization that economics never managed to merge their morals.
So what does this all mean? The philosophical divide is where this deep dive gets incredibly compelling. We are looking at two fundamentally different visions of what society should even value.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Keynes viewed capitalism merely as a tool for human flourishing. It wasn't a sacred system to him.
He actually envisioned a future where technological productivity would become so high that humanity would only need a 15-hour work week.
Which sounds amazing.
Right, leaving the rest of our time for art, philosophy, and actual human connection.
To Keynes, economics was a way to solve the basic problem of survival so we could focus on actual living. Because of that view, a 25% unemployment rate wasn't just some mathematical inefficiency. It was a profound moral catastrophe.
It demanded government intervention.
Exactly. For Keynes, outcomes matter. If the economic system produces mass suffering, you are morally obligated to intervene and change the system.
But Friedman's moral compass pointed in a completely different direction. For Friedman, economic freedom is the bedrock of all political liberty. He believed that a concentrated government is the ultimate threat to human freedom. Like, if a government has the power to manage the economy, it inherently possesses the power to coerce you.
Procedures and freedom matter more to Friedman than guaranteed outcomes. The government must be restrained to protect individual liberty. But, and the sources highlight a nuance that often gets lost here, Friedman was not heartless toward the poor.
Not at all.
He was a major advocate for the negative income tax.
The mechanism of the negative income tax is fascinating. It's basically a guaranteed minimum income system. If you earn below a certain threshold, you don't pay taxes. The government actually pays you a percentage of the difference.
He wanted to use that direct cash transfer system to completely dismantle the bureaucratic welfare state. He viewed massive government welfare agencies as paternalistic and inefficient. Instead of having a bureaucracy dictate what kind of housing or food a person can have, give them the cash and let them make their own choices.
It empowers individuals rather than empowering the state. It all boils down to consequentialism versus procedural justice. Keynes argues outcomes matter morally. The government must act to stop suffering, even if it means centralizing power.
And Friedman argues procedures and freedom matter morally. The government must be restrained to protect individual liberty, and we should empower individuals to navigate their own lives.
Macroeconomic governance clearly requires both toolkits. The real art of modern policy is not choosing one side forever. It is correctly diagnosing which thinker applies to the specific crisis of the moment.
And diagnosing the future is going to test these frameworks all over again.
It really is.
Looking at the horizon raises a critical question for everyone listening. As we enter an era of massive AI automation, if technology permanently displaces millions of workers and permanently shifts the structural natural rate of unemployment, does Friedman's hands-off procedural theory still hold up?
That's a huge unknown.
Or does Keynes' moral imperative for government intervention, perhaps through universal basic income or massive public works, become the only way to save capitalism from itself?
It is the ultimate collision of math, morals, and our future. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe.